Hello and welcome to Unbelievable with me, your host Andy Kind. It's a roadshow. We're at Aylesbury High School here in Aylesbury, and I've been joined by two esteemed gentlemen guests. We have Dr. Simon Walker-Samuel to my right, and on my left, Dr. Denis Alexander. And today we are debating the question of, are we slaves to our genes? I just want to establish some credentials first of all. So, Simon, could you, in the space of 20 seconds, give us a little backstory?
Yep. Yeah, of course. So I'm Professor of Biophysics at University College London. I run the Centre for Computational Medicine. My background is in physics though, but applied to medicine and biology now. But I call myself a humanist. So I do a lot of work for Humanist UK. I'm a trustee there. I do school speaking. I sit on a SACRE, which sets the RE curriculum for Croydon. So that's my quick, in a nutshell, background.
Fantastic. And Denis, same for you?
Yes, I'm a biochemist by background, and I started out life doing a PhD at the Institute of Psychiatry, but I sensed the call of God, go and help in science in the Middle East for 15 years. So I did that for 15 years and then came back, ended up at a research institute in Cambridge, and I'm now retired. And for a retirement job, I decided with a colleague to set up an institute called the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. So as a Christian, I thought that would be a good thing to do in my retirement, and I've passed that on now, so I'm still retired and enjoying my retirement.
Absolutely wonderful. High credentials for both of you, and I can add to that, I am a stand-up comedian. Right, let's carry on with the show then. Let's start with the question of what genetics is. Denis.
Yeah, so genetics obviously refers to the study of the genes, and you say, well, when did that start? And it started in about the year 1900, when people first realized that there were little sections of the DNA of the genetic material, and those sections actually they started calling genes, and those are the sections which encode things like proteins that make up our bodies. So basically now you can define a gene as any bit of the DNA that actually encodes something useful for the body, which could be DNA, it could be RNA, and they're also genes. And the number of genes that we have that actually encode proteins is actually quite small. It's only around 20,000. People used to think it's about 100,000. And then the DNA of our, which is in every cell of our bodies, except our red blood cells, that finally was sequenced to get all the sequence of the genetic letters, the nucleotides. That was finally done in 2003 was published. And then people suddenly realized, oh, we've only got 20,000 genes. That's not as many as we thought. So genes, genetics is really this central study of how they work, what they do, where they come from, and how big is their influence in our lives.
And have there been dramatic developments and progressive shifts over the last few years in genetic science?
It depends how you define few. And so, I mean, the really big dramatic shift, of course, was way back in early 1950s when the structure of DNA was discovered to be a double helix, a beautiful double helix. So that was a really big step forward. I would say the sequencing of the genome that I just mentioned, that is to work out the 3.2 billion genetic letters, nucleotide bases, that was done, as I mentioned, only a few years ago actually. So that's been a big breakthrough. Another big breakthrough, which is much more recent, is a genetic engineering technique, which we can just call CRISPR. It sounds like toast. It's not about toast, but it's about CRISPR, and that's a special technology that can you use to get into a cell, and you can modify the DNA sequence, the genetic letter sequence in that cell. And that really has been a big breakthrough in terms of being able to manipulate genes and do new things with genes. So that's a big breakthrough as well.
That's fantastic. Simon, we'll turn to you as I shift my entire frame in your direction. You described yourself as a humanist, which is interesting because you would say that there is no God. Would you say that ultimately you are a materialist?
I'd say yes. That can mean a lot of different things, but I believe in a natural world. I don't believe there's anything supernatural. I wouldn't go as far as to say I could say with definite confidence there is no God, but I don't believe personally that there is enough evidence to make myself say that I do believe in one.
So would you be a militant agnostic like Darwin ended up, or?
Yeah, I like to think that I support all of my beliefs with evidence.
Yes.
And that would be physical evidence from some kind of measurement within the world.
Yeah.
I don't like to ascribe a belief to anything that goes beyond that, even though it's quite nice to think there might be other things out there. But I can't quite take that step to form that belief.
Yeah, sure. As a humanist, though, you have this idea that you use the word sacré, the French for sacred, that human beings are sacred in some way. So from your perspective then, are we more than our genes? Are we more than the sum total of our genes?
So I think one thing that science has realized in particular about genetics is that there is very rarely a gene for something. It's far, far more complex than that. And I think genes are kind of this compressed way, a bit like a JPEG. So, this idea of having, you've got all the information within an image, but it's compressed down. So all the sort of redundant information is lost. So I think genes kind of act as this sort of compressed way of storing information, which can then be transferred between generations of an organism. So, but it's done in a very complex way. So genes encode for proteins, but in a way that isn't just through that gene. So certain genes can be turned on or off, depending on how they're configured within the chromosome. There's sort of secondary structures called the histones, for example, that then further moderate, and there's methylation. So there's all these additional steps that take us not just from the simple genetics, but to kind of how we are as, our physical form, the way our organs are, their shapes, that kind of thing. So it is very, very complex. So to your question, we are more than just the genetics, because we are also our interaction with our environments as well.
Yeah. Well, it's a splendid answer. Denis, let's just touch on agnosticism, because I saw you interviewed once where you were asked about whether agnosticism was a good place for a scientist to be. I think you said something like, it's okay, it's fine, maybe it's a good starting point for muggles, for neutrals, but when you're in science, you actually do need to commit to something. You are committed to the intelligibility of the universe, for instance. So could you, as someone who's a scientist and also a Christian, could you touch on the idea of whether agnosticism, saying I don't know, is a good place to be?
Well, I think I just want to come back actually to, you mentioned Darwin, Charles Darwin, who's a great hero of mine. It won't surprise you to hear that. But I mean, Charles Darwin was not, I think you used the word a sort of committed agnostic or something like
militant,
that. A militant, yeah. You said a militant. I wouldn't call him a militant agnostic. I mean, Charles Darwin he was a great Victorian gentleman. He was always kind of hesitant about everything, pretty much, okay? And so he became an agnostic in later life simply because his little daughter Annie, aged 11 or 12 at the time, died, and that really shook his faith, actually. So that's why he got shaken up about that. But he was always a very tentative agnostic, and he wondered, it changed. Some days he said, I think I really should be called a theist, someone who believes in God, and some days I feel I don't, So I think agnosticism, yeah. I mean, actually, I have quite a lot of friends who are agnostics, but I always feel it's like a very committed metaphysical worldview. By metaphysical worldview, we mean a worldview that goes beyond science. Because I guess you can have two forms of agnosticism. You can have a form that says, well, I don't know, there's just not enough evidence to point in any direction in terms of is there a God or not, or that sort of thing. So that's sort of one kind of gentle agnosticism. But when the term was first invented, actually, and it wasn't invented until 1869, the word came into being. And that's when Darwin first said, oh, I think I'm one of those, okay? Right. Once you got a label for it, then you know what you are, you see. But at the time, it was much more, no, we are committed, to agnosticism. It's like a very strong commitment, Yeah. We definitely cannot know in any way. So I think there's two flavors there, actually. It's worth sorting out the flavors a little bit. Yeah. And we can talk about that maybe, but... Yes, let me move my chair back. But just in terms of a lab, I mean, if you're running a laboratory, I mean, like my colleague here, Simon, I've had hundreds of people flow through my lab over the years, over the centuries? No, over the decades. Okay, so, but they're just a complete mix of people I've got. Muslims and Jews and Christians and agnostic and atheists, and most of the time I have no idea unless we have a coffee time conversation. Yeah. So I think one of the great things about science is you can commit, whatever your worldview, you can commit to something with certain principles and certain ways of doing things, certain techniques. And that is a commitment. You know, you have to keep to the rules, as it were, within a certain frame if you're going to get anywhere with science. So I think that is interesting, you know, that science is full of committed people.
Yeah. And just a point on evidence, and you said you don't like to believe anything that can't be evidence. For you, as someone who is an academic and a scientist, Simon, would you say that all other paths to truth, whether that be spiritual truth or artistic truth, aesthetic truth, is there a point at which for you that has to be subjugated by empirical truth? Is scientific truth the king of the castle?
Yes, is a simple answer. It is, and truth, the truth is out there, is the sort of strapline from X-Files, which probably no one in this room remembers, but it is something about the material universe that, you know, that there is a sort of material reality that we can touch and sort of experience. As far as we know, I don't think I'm sort of trapped in the matrix. I think I'm actually sort of experiencing this world in the same way that you are and that others are. So there is a truth to this kind of material experience. And the only way that we can kind of sample it and understanding it is by poking it or lifting it up and dropping it and seeing what happens. I think that is the only way to truth. The kind of poetic truths you're saying about, you know, can we understand the world through music or something like that? That is a different thing, and that kind of speaks to our kind of ways of sort of emotionally being in the world. And I think even that, I think emotions are a material manifestation of our internal brain state. So it's all materialist, and it all can be evidenced. If it can't be, it may as well not exist. Okay. So that's where I sort of suspend my, you know, my desire to believe in it or not.
Yeah, well, another good point and well made. Dennis, are you in accordance with what Simon's talking about? As a Christian, you would perhaps have a slightly different view on paths to truth, would you?
Yes, I think there are different kinds of truths. I think scientific truths obviously are very, very central, very important. But I think there's, excuse me, I think there's quite a range of truths. I mean, I actually think there are moral truths. I think everybody in the world believes rape is wrong. I just think it's a moral truth. You know, we all agree on that. I don't think science shows you that. I think lots of other things show you that, but, you know, and so I think there are I think there are political truths, actually. I want to call them truths. I think the evidence in support of democracy is pretty strong, okay? So you might not want to call it a truth, you know, just a position or some kind. You can change the language a little bit to get out of these things, you know, but so I think there are many paths to knowing something. I would say I know that my wife loves me. Is that a truth? I have good evidence for that. You know, we've been married for 54 years. That's not too bad, you know. So I think that's based on a lot of evidence, you know, of knowing each other and serving each other over 54 years. So I think if you ask me, is it a real truth that my wife loves me? I say, yeah, I think so. It's based on evidence. It's not scientific evidence, you know. Yeah. I don't analyze her hormones and look at her genes every day. I don't do that, you know. But as you'll be happy to hear, but, you know, I do think that a belief that my wife loves me is a very well justified belief. So I prefer to talk about justified beliefs. You know, what sort of beliefs are well justified? And sometimes that can get you awake. Otherwise, you can end up in a bit of a tangle. What is a truth? You know, what we count as truths and all that kind of thing. So, but I think having well justified beliefs is really important.
Yeah. Do you have any comeback on that, Simon?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't know your wife or your relationship or anything, but there is you know that truth about, you know, in anyone's relationship, your partner loves you through a process of examining that relationship and understanding it and experiencing it, and that is a sort of materialistic understanding. It's not quite scientific. If you were to do it scientifically, you might want to see if it's reproducible. You might want to kind of keep going back and checking, but that you are probing reality via your interaction with your wife, your partner, to understand and infer whether they love you. So that is a scientific, it's a materialistic interaction. And I'd say it's the same kind of truth. It's that you are understanding reality by perturbing it somehow through a conversation or kind of watching what they do, how they interact with you. So it's no different than understanding any other aspect of the world, albeit a lot more complex and human. So I don't think it's any different from any other kind of materialistic truth.
Right. So I think what you can do, though, I think, is think about different disciplines, think about sociology, think about history, think about science, think about the divinity, faculty of divinity in Cambridge, for example. And you can draw a circle for each one, you have circles. And clearly, the way they go about things, there's a lot of overlap between them. Okay, you can think about historical truths, historical evidence. Did the Holocaust happen? Yes, it did. The evidence is overwhelming. So if you're looking for evidence, there can be a lot of overlap between these different disciplines, these different academic disciplines, and I think that touches really on what you're saying here. But I think one has to be careful that we, as scientists, we don't pretend that our truth is going to be the answer to all these other truths. Okay, I mean, historians have their own way of doing things. Lawyers definitely have their own way of doing things, but they believe in evidence, they believe in looking at things and so forth, and historians, it's not reproducible. That's by definition what a history is about. So did it happen or not? So I think you can get into historical truths that are very well supported. I wouldn't want to call them science. I think that simply means we're being a little bit arrogant, I think, as scientists to claim that's science. No, it's not science. It's got similarities, but it's not really what we do in the lab. It's not really experimental science. History is something distinct. It's something different.
It is, but I guess that goes back to why I say that kind of science is the kind of the pinnacle of the kind of knowledge way of defining knowledge, because the kind of thing, the kind of phenomena, the kind of systems that we can apply a scientific method to, where we can kind of poke it in controlled ways, we can do that over and over again and make sure that it responds in the same way, is a much higher standard of evidence than you get in historical sciences, than you might get in archaeology, where you don't have that ability to reproduce it. Even astrophysics, you've got the same limitations. You can't go up to a star and particularly easily and kind of sample it in any kind of in the same way you might do to a physics experiment in the lab, for example. So I guess that history has a set of methods amenable to it that provide evidence that aren't quite at that same level or standard that science can provide you. But it's the same set of mechanisms ultimately.
Yeah, I think we're agreed on that. I think I think you're absolutely right that science is a great way of knowing things, and sometimes it can be completely wrong if you look at history. But and we need to be humble about that as scientists. Sometimes we get it completely wrong. But as a way of having a high standard of truth, I think I would thoroughly agree with that. But of course, we live in a real world where we have personal interactions, we have politics, and we have many difficult things to tackle. And science isn't unfortunately going to help us with some of, does science really help you to know whether you should invade another country? Not really. Okay, so there's a lot of big issues in life that go way beyond science. And
true, but they are often guided by scientific knowledge. So you might invade a country for its mineral reserves, which you know about through geological surveys, for example. So we use that kind of scientific knowledge to guide us all the time, even in our kind of moral decisions. So animal experimentation, for example, in apes has been very much curtailed now, because we understand that the genetics of apes are very similar. We are apes fundamentally, so we don't now want to experiment on apes because we realize how close they are to us, taxonomically. So that is very much a decision that's guided by our sort of intuitions as humans, but also by the scientific evidence through genetics.
We need to bring it back. We're leaving a lot of tantalizing threads for questions in the second half. But let's look at the question. Let's drill down into that debating question. Are we slaves to our genes? Are we, as Richard Dawkins said in one of his early works, simply dancing to the music of our DNA? Simon?
Yes and
no.
Is
that too strong a word to say that we are slaves? It's a very emotive word anyway.
Absolutely,
isn't it?
yeah. And I think we'd agree that we are not fundamentally constrained by our genetics. We're limited by our genetics. We can't grow wings and we can't fly, because of our genes and because of physics fundamentally. So there are constraints that our genes and genetics put on us that are more subtle, and they kind of give nudges, they kind of give steers to the way we might be, our shapes, how any number of aspects of our personalities, for example, are slightly predicated by genes, but also by our environment. So how we were raised, our understanding of the world, the things we've been through, physical constraints. So I'd say no, slaves is too strong a word.
Too strong a word. Denis?
Yes, I mean, part of the reason for choosing that title, Are We Slaves to Our Genes, was to give the answer no.
Yeah.
So I think we probably agreed on that. You know how publishers like, to have titles that will help sell the book, okay?
Yeah.
So, but having said that, I think we have to think about a kind of spectrum, really, if you're thinking about free will and determinism and all these big kind of philosophical questions. So if you look at the genetic sort of variation that we have in the population, for sad reasons, there are, genetic mutations that will lead to bad outcomes in life, to pathological conditions that are really constraining. And so I think we could honestly say that although the slavery word is too strong for that, but on the other hand, it might lead to a certain condition that really restricts one's freedom. And so in a sense, the slavery word too strong, but you're highly restricted by a particular genetic condition. And there are around 7,000 genetic diseases. I mean, it depends, you can count them different ways, but it's something like that, which are due to just point mutations, just single mutations in genes. Okay, so it's a very big number. Fortunately, they're very rare. But even if you take our common diseases, the Western world, heart disease or things like that, high blood pressure and so forth, these are polygenic. There are many genetic variants that will influence your likelihood that you will develop that particular disease or pathology. So in other words, I think it's useful to think of a spectrum here. Mm-hmm. We're all on that spectrum somewhere, and most of us, thank God, are on this part of the spectrum where we don't have any particular deadly diseases or something like that, but still we are influenced by, especially in development. And I think it's good to remember that the influence of our genes is not like I'm having influence on my gene now as I sit here in my behavior, I hope so much, but in terms of development, then we grow up. It's like things are given to us, our personalities are given to us by our developmental biology, where the genes and the environments are integrated right from the very word go, from the fertilization of the egg, right there back at the beginning. So we're sort of products of that long process of integration, as Simon said, of integration between the genes and the environment, always integrating together in a very tight network there.
Simon, anything to add from that? I mean, I have to say, we've flown through it, haven't we? It's been a very impressive whistle-stop tour. Any thoughts on what Denis has said?
Yes, I guess where the interesting part is where our worldviews maybe differ, because I think we agree on the genetics fundamentally, because the science is fairly settled that there are diseases, as Denis says, that can, or there are mutations or predispositions within your genetics that lead you to certain diseases. That for me is a partially deterministic, maybe fully deterministic. I'm wondering how to state this. There are certain genetic conditions that will pretty definitely lead you to a certain disease, much in a similar way to cancer, that mutations during your lifetime in a particular cell can lead to getting a tumor in a certain place and then fundamentally and ultimately dying of that disease. Determinism is the interesting part of that. So is that predetermined, so that if you have this sort of genetic predisposition, you will always get that disease and you're always on that trajectory? I would say, from my sort of background as a physicist, that most evidence points to the world being pretty deterministic. So if we could fully understand, like Laplace's demon, this idea, if we could fully understand the configuration of every particle in the world, we could probably predict the outcome. And that has implications then for free will, for example. Do we have free will in the world? I think looking at Denis's book, we might sort of partially disagree on that. I like to think that we've got free will because I feel like I have. Yeah. I can make decisions that change my path through life. Equally, looking at physics, for example, as a science, that tends to suggest that I don't, that we are a physical process ourselves, and we're ultimately similar to a river flowing downhill, that we're just following this path of thermodynamics that will take us to an ultimate endpoint that maybe we don't have control over. So I'm conflicted in that, because I feel strongly like I do have free will.
Yeah.
But quite possibly the science tells me that I don't.
Yeah, okay.
So this idea, this maybe fits into this picture of, are we slaves to our genes? Is everything predetermined? Do we have free will to change it? It's not just genetics that are kind of constraining what we do. Yeah. It may be just the universe fundamentally that constrains what we do.
So you're veering towards a reluctant yes.
I veer towards a reluctant yeah. I don't think we have free will. It really feels like it, and I'm reluctant to say it, but everything suggests to me through my reading and understanding of the universe that we don't have free will.
So I'll tell you a funny story about this, actually. So I wrote this book, Are We Slaves to Our Genes? It's from Cambridge University Press. And I thought, boy, I'm not a philosopher. I'm going to leave out free will and determinism. That's beyond my pay grade. Okay, so, and I sent it off to the publishers, and it went off to the reviewers. You know, they all come back with wise statements about how it should be improved. And the end point was, they said, no, we definitely need a chapter on free will and determinism. And so I kind of groaned to myself, oh no, okay. Anyway, and I said, okay, if that's the only way this book's going to get published by a good press, then I'll do it. Okay, so I bought about 20 books on philosophy of determinism and free will and all that kind of stuff. And to my great surprise, I ended up actually more convinced about believing in free will than when I started. And I share Simon's sort of hesitations. On one side, you know, you have this great deep passion and feeling that I chose to be here. I didn't get forced to come to this school to do this. You know, I really did. I just driven over from Cambridge. You know, I chose to do that, and so forth. So we have that deep, deep feeling, and it's, by the way, it's a universal feeling. There have been sociological studies of every ethnic group of tribe and people of the world, and everybody has that feeling. Okay, it's a universal human feeling. Okay. So, but actually, then what I realized was, there's a great book, by the way, by Christian List, Why Free Will is Real, it's published by Harvard University Press. It's and he takes on board all the science, but he says, look, basically, thinking about free will in scientific terms is just the wrong way to go about it. Okay, because if you're going to understand human complexity, which we try and understand, you've got to have different levels. You know, after all, think about mind. What is mind? Well, it's an emergence from brain. I think we could say that. It's an emergent, what we call it, sort of comes out of our central nervous system. It comes out of our brains. And if you're talking about mind, you've got to think about a different level. You've got to think about the level of mind. You've got to think about a level of intentionality and all the language we use, our psychological language, the language we're using here. He just said it's not relevant, talking about free will, to start talking about neurons and synaptic connections and the complexity of the brain. What you needed to do is start with the language we use as we're using here, you know, the language of speech. And we talk about this deep experience we have, talk about a physical reality, this deep experience we have of feeling free. So the question you need to ask is there anything in science that would necessarily counteract against that deep feeling being an illusion? We have deep feelings that can be illusory. And he would say, no, that's not necessarily, that isn't the case, actually. And you can take the analogy, just to use more of Simon's field, I mean, take AI and take ChatGPT, as we're here, you know, or something like that. And to be honest, people in the AI field, that say, they tell me, I'm a biologist, so I only know what I'm told by them, is basically that can do things. You know, that AI program can produce an interesting result. You actually don't know what's going on at that moment. You actually, you know, if you try to analyze it step by step, systematically, scientifically, actually you don't know. And so I think it gives a kind of interesting metaphor, an interesting analogy, if you like, of where we are with this. We have a deep and fundamental experience. And in a sense, it's like, how can I see blue or green, you know? Do I really understand that? I understand quite a bit of the science about it, but it's not the same as experiencing it. It's not the same as seeing the color blue or the color green. So as an agent, you know, the particular properties of us as agents, as free agents, I would say, that goes almost beyond science. That you know, that escapes the network. You know, you can understand all the science you want, but actually it doesn't tell you why I see blue, and it doesn't tell you why I experience free will. So I think that's somewhere you sort of begin the conversation in a way I find helpful. Anyway.
Sure. Well, we need to make a slight change of direction. We'll make sure that Simon has the lion's share of the speaking in this second part. You're listening to Unbelievable with me, Andy Kine. We're asking the question, are we slaves to our genes? Our guests, Dr. Denis Alexander and Dr. Simon Walker-Samuel, have been absolutely fantastic so far. We're now going to open it up to questions from the students, and I'm sure, as I said, there's a lot of loose threads that could be pulled on. Maybe you've got questions about genetics, maybe you've got questions about free will, determinism, maybe you've got questions about AI and the future of science, but we do welcome questions on anything that's been taken from the conversation so far. So we've got a wonderful question about free will. If we have no free will, Simon, how does that affect our judicial system? Can people be held culpable for the crimes that they commit if they were simply predetermined to do so?
It is a very deep question, and given that we don't really know if we have free will or not, I think we have to ultimately take a very pragmatic approach and assume that we do have free will and that we are culpable for our actions, and we have to take responsibility for our actions. And the judicial system has a key role in upholding kind of social cohesion and making sure people behave themselves fundamentally. So that kind of pragmatic approach. But it is a great question. Are we responsible for our actions, or are we, as I said before, just kind of rivers flowing downhill? Are we kind of physical processes and it's fully deterministic and we've ended up in this place beyond our own will because we ultimately don't have it? And I think that's an interesting potential divide between our worldviews. So I think usually the Christian worldview, and I'm not a Christian, so it's not my area, is that we are given free will to kind of choose and make our own choices, and that's fundamentally part of the Christian theology. And as an atheist, as a humanist, I'm not so sure. I guess I feel a greater liberty to kind of muse on these ideas and maybe go with the idea that we don't have free will, and we are just this kind of physical process, and that we have to pragmatically take responsibility. But even taking responsibility isn't a free will based action. It's something we're inevitably going to do or we're not going to do. Yeah. So, and these, I think this is philosophy, the philosophical questions at where we are currently. Yeah. But advances in neuroscience, in our understanding of consciousness, they are going to become scientific questions. They are becoming scientific questions. So I think saying this is outside the realm of science, currently it is, but I think it may soon become the realm of science, where we'll get a better understanding of exactly this kind of thing. And neuroscience is fascinating for free will. So there's one idea that we can measure neurological activity before we have a physical sensation of making a decision. And it's controversial how that's interpreted, but there are scientific methods that may give us the kind of understanding of whether we have this kind of conscious feeling overlaid on top of what is fundamentally just deterministic.
Fantastic. Denis, any appendix to that?
Yeah, just an appendix. I mean, first of all, you've referred the whole panel as being hesitant about free will. Half the panel is hesitant. This half up this end. I definitely believe in free will. Okay, that's why I wrote this book, Are We Slaves to Our Genes, really as a defense of free will, so in that sense. But also as believing entirely with what Simon says, that we are completely physical beings. I think we're all agreed on that. But I find it very interesting. I'm not sure it's a question of Christian or atheist sort of thing at this point. You see, I have a lot of atheist friends who are passionately defenders of free will. I mean, Julian Baggini is one, and they call themselves compatibilists. Okay, and compatibilists are those who believe that that science works exactly as we've been describing, and the brain works in a scientific way. Absolutely, neurosciences. I spent half my life on neurosciences. Passionately believe in that. But also, it's because of that, what we call gnomic regularity, it's because of that law-like behavior of the brain and the nervous system that we have free will. That's the explanation of why we have free will, because the system is working well. Just as AI is working really well, when you have this emergent, wonderful conclusion, which happens to be true, out of that AI system, even though when you poke around, you think, not sure how he did it, So, and I think we're at that point where, to have a rigorous evidential proof of free will in the scientific is really difficult. That's difficult. And I'm not sure it's going to happen in my lifetime. Philosophers have been struggling it for a couple of thousand years. So I think asking the other way around, is there anything necessarily in science that undermines the understanding of free will? I would want to say no to that question. So that's sort of putting the question a little bit the other way around. Fantastic. And I just find we can get further with that sort of discussion.
We've got a question on identical twins, and we have to say that identical twins primarily very creepy. But is there anything in twin studies that can give us some inklings as to what's going on there?
Yeah, I think certainly. And so the thing about twin studies is often identical twins. We've probably got some here, so I have to be careful what I'm saying here. But they're often more different from each other than you might expect. And the reasons for that, partly environmental. One chooses in life to be a scientist, the other chooses to be an artist or something. Okay, they've got their own free will, their own choice, they go in different directions. But at the genetic level, epigenetically, they are very different very often. Now, epigenetically is what Simon mentioned earlier. Those are the modifications of the genes that they're actually chemical modifications that are actually can be inherited, in fact, in some cases. And those control which genes are switched on or off or modulated in some way. And so they affect the personality, they affect the response of that individual to the environment and many, many other things. So epigenetically, although the identical twins are identical at the genetic level, genetic letters level, at that level, at the epigenetic level, they can be very different actually. I wanted a little look at, you might expect identical twins would die at the same age. I know, not a very cheerful topic, or similar age, And I was interested when I was doing research on this particular book to look that up, and there's several studies on that. In fact, they die at quite different ages very often, almost as different as two brothers and sisters, or sister and sister, who are not twins, but who die at very different ages. And of course, the reason is the environment. Some have illnesses, some don't, and all the different complexities of life, they end up quite different. So I think it's good to remember that actually they have their own human identity very much.
So genetically identical, but having this strange sense of uniqueness, unique identity. The question, I suppose, if we are slaves to our genes, does that negate the idea of the self or the soul, personal identity? And Simon, I'll let you answer, and maybe you want to sort of play fast and loose with the term soul, but we'll see how you get on.
So I don't believe that there is any such thing as a soul, because I think that's that comes with a belief in a God and an afterlife and that kind of thing. Things that I don't believe, and I think if there were such a thing as a soul, we should be able to detect it, because it should be able to interact with our brains and the rest of, so there should be something that we can again poke or kind of tip upside down and actually see if it's there or not. So I don't think we have a soul. Our personality is something that arises from our brain and from our minds, and it's again an emergent phenomenon that we're talking about. So, and probably predicated by our genes. So I think certain aspects of our personalities are probably based on the genes we've inherited from our parents, but also the way our parents are with us through childhood, and all your experiences throughout your lifetime, they shape your personality. So you have all these kind of nudges and kind of influences that take you to be the person you are at any given moment. So it's not a soul thing, I would say, but there are multiple influences that do that, and also that decide what we believe in. So our belief is very much based on our environments. So if you're brought up in the UK, for example, most likely you're going to be a Christian, less likely you'll be a Muslim, and probably you'll be an atheist. There's a lot more atheists in the UK than there ever were previously. So that's very much an aspect of your environment. Whereas if you grew up in another country, say in the Middle East, you're more likely to be a Muslim. If you grow up in India, you're more likely to be a Hindu. So your beliefs are very much a product
or at least
the
your
environment.
starting beliefs. Anyway.
It's very rare that people change their beliefs. People tend to stick. It does happen, but it's pretty unusual that people switch between religions. Whatever worldview you're brought up in tends to be the one you stick with, statistically.
I think certainly in the Western world, but Dennis, we might want to talk about the explosion of the underground church in places like China and South Korea, places like that?
We'll come to that in a moment. Can I just come back to soul?
Of course you can.
Okay.
I want you to come back to soul.
Thank you. So Simon doesn't believe in a Platonic soul, and neither do I. Okay, so we're united in that. We disbelieve in the Platonic soul. Now, of course, the problem about the word soul is it's got a number of different meanings. Actually, there's a little experiment you can do. Here's an experiment. If you go to the King James Version, the old version of the Bible, you will find the word soul many, many times. My soul made me do this. My soul thought this. My soul did that. Okay. Now you come to the modern English translations. The word soul's disappeared. Where's it gone? It's got the word I. Okay, I. And that I think we probably sort of kind of agree on this. So I think actually when you look at the biblical perspective on the soul, it's a kind of theological study, but it's really the identity, the person, the real person. That's the soulishness. It comes out of Aristotle as well, an Aristotelian thought, not Platonic thought, but Aristotle. If you're doing a little study on comparing Plato and Aristotle, so I think the soul is the real person. And I think we might agree more on that. The real personhood is the soul, because the Bible is much more interested in the resurrection of the body. It's not about the resurrection. Immortality in the New Testament doesn't refer to the soul. No, it's the resurrection. That's where you get immortality language referred to. So it's a very physical, bodily thing, So I think we're sort of agreed on the physical aspect of that, in a sense, anyway. But coming also back to the question, then it does have an impact then on how we think about the emergent personality and emergent identity of a person, which is very much given to us, isn't it? We don't choose our personalities. That's one thing we don't have a choice about. They are given to us when we are aged 0 to 5 or something, or a bit more than that, and we inherit those personalities through genes and environment being woven together and so forth. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. So we might find we're more in agreement on that one, I think, possibly. In terms of people changing their religion, I don't agree with Simon about that. I just know thousands of people who've changed their religion. And maybe it's because I lived in the Middle East and I've been around the world a lot of times and just met with loads of different people. And you go and visit. I mean, the biggest growth in the church over the past few decades is in Iran. Okay. It's not publicized. People don't know much about that. If you want to look at church growth, if you go back a little bit more, the biggest church growth in the world is in China, as we mentioned. The church is huge, and people coming out of secular communist backgrounds, which I call a religion. I mean, communism is a religion to me. Well, I think humanism is a religion, but we better not go there.
Hold your horse.
Here we go.
Back off, Simon.
It's not, but yeah.
That's for another day.
Another day, okay. But anyway, I think, people have worldviews. Let's go to worldviews, different worldviews.
I'll go with that. Yeah.
I just see people changing their worldview all the time, actually. I don't know.
I think the statistics would paint a different picture. It's not that it doesn't happen, it's rare. So most people are born into a particular religion or worldview, and they tend to stick with that throughout their lifetime. So the vast majority of people don't change worldview, don't change religion. That's not to say it doesn't happen. People convert, and those things do. And as you say, you've met a few of them, but it is actually quite a rare event according to statistics. So, and that's science. It's more science to kind of back up our understanding.
And I suppose that may commit. I mean, it's not the main topic of the debate, and we need to finish up. But that may also commit the genetic fallacy, the idea that the fact you can show how a belief has developed sort of negates the belief in itself. But that's again for another day. We'll get you back to spar over whether humanism is a religion. Can't wait for that one. We've got time for one more quick question. A question then, again, about gender and the impacts of being born a certain way, the limitations that can bring. Any thoughts on that briefly?
I mean, it kind of touches on a lot of the themes that we've been discussing before. So you're dealt a certain hand at birth, and that then shapes and sort of nudges certain directions through your life. Whether that's a limitation, whether it's an advantage, very much depends on your environment. And I think if you're a woman, you have a different experience of the world probably than if you're a man, in a statistical way. So you can't say particularly hard and fast truths about what men experience and what women experience, but generally there's a certain sort of pattern particularly in Western society, that you can probably predict to be a certain way. So that is definitely a genetic predisposition, and I think you're absolutely right to touch on that. Is a very good example of how genes will shape your path in a particular way, whereas other things not so quite so cleanly.
We've certainly set up a lot of future debates over the course of these questions. Denis, any?
Well, just to say also, I agree with Simon on that. Yes, I agree. But also as a Christian, I would want to say that whatever kind of birth you have in terms of your personality and so forth, in the Christian worldview, God loves you the way you are. And I think that's a very, very important thing. God loves diversity. God loves people being the way they are. And I think that is very important. We're all made in the image of God, according to the Bible. We all are valuable because we have the absolute value because made in God's image. And so God, that means that, whatever your genetics, whatever your diversity, whatever your background, God loves you the way you are. And I think that's a very encouraging and supportive, if you like, worldview to have for people in their different diversity identities.
Well, we've been treated here to two top-level academic scientists, one a humanist, one a Christian, and I hope for the benefit of all the people listening, whether you're in the room or online, whether you agree with either of them or not, you'll have some respect for the fact that these are very clever and well-researched academic people who really care about the answers that they're giving and are willing to engage in friendly debate. It hasn't been irascible, it hasn't been aggressive, and that's the culture that we're trying to create. So people pursuing reason and truth for the good of humanity, and whether we're free to do that or not, well, we couldn't quite work that out, could we, in the end? But thank you for tuning into Unbelievable with me, Andy Kine, and my guests, Simon Walker-Samuel and Denis Alexander. Tune in again for more fantastic content, and would the people here in the room help me to thank the panel in the standard way.